Okay. Okay, thanks everybody. So, good afternoon, and thanks for joining us. My name is Joe Barber, and I'm a fellow of the English Association and a senior lecturer in English education at Manchester Met University. Thanks very much for joining us. It's very nice to see so many people here for the event this evening. I'm really pleased to be hosting this session tonight, as well as taking part in the discussion with my two colleagues who are joining us for the event. A bit about the English Association before we make a start. The English Association is a learned society and subject association which was founded in 1906 to promote, support and celebrate the discipline of English studies. The EA covers all stages of education from primary and early years through to secondary and further education, right up to higher education and beyond. And we also cover all parts of the discipline across language, linguistics, literature and creative writing. Events like this one are made possible by the fantastic contribution of our volunteer speakers. So thank you to tonight's speakers, Dr. Janine Bradbury and Dr. Wendy Lennon. Our members make it possible to keep these events free and open to all by paying their membership fees. If you would like to contribute to the that was a Freudian slip, to the national conversation about English and help support our discipline, please consider joining us. It costs around £1 per week to support our events and campaigning work for a whole year, and you'll get access to a range of member benefits, including online access to all of the English Association journals. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers for the discussion on what it means to teach context. Before I do that, I'm just going to admit some people to the meeting. There we go. So I've introduced myself, Dr. Joe Barber from Manchester Metropolitan University, a senior lecturer in English education, and I lead the English PGCE secondary course. I'm also a committee member of the English Association Secondary and Further Education Committee and a fellow of the English Association. I'm joined by Dr. Janine Bradbury, who's senior lecturer in contemporary writing and culture at the University of York. She's an award-winning poet and critic, working across several research areas, including African American and Black British writing, popular culture and creative writing. So welcome, Janine. It's very nice to have you here. We're also joined by Dr. Wendy Lennon. Wendy obtained her PhD from the Shakespeare Institute in 2024. Like me, a very recent and probably slightly still traumatized experience, Wendy. Wendy is an academic researcher and English teacher working across literature, geography, history and race. So a very warm welcome to both of you. Thanks for joining us. So without further ado, I think we'll get into the discussion about context in literature. And I wanted to sort of structure the event really around some key questions that we've kind of formulated. And the first of those is quite an obvious place to start, really. It perhaps seems too obvious, really, but I think it's quite important to establish what it is we're talking about. So what do we mean when we talk about context in English literature? Janine, can I turn to you first?
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Joe, for chairing this and for the lovely introduction and the warm welcome. What do we mean by context? Well, my disclaimer before I begin is to say that I teach primarily in higher education. I do some workshops beyond that, but that's my main reference point. So that's my proviso. And in higher education English degrees, historical context tends to be what springs to mind when we think about context. As well as, I suppose, the context of publication of a particular work. So they're the sort of ideas that I've been trying to negotiate my way around and through. But I think it can mean many things. And I think sometimes that contextual information can be other primary materials that a novel or a poem or a play or something that I might be teaching might be in conversation with. But I feel like some of those other definitions of context sometimes are kind of overshadowed by this kind of domineering idea of history.
Thanks, Janine. Wendy, what are your thoughts?
Hi everyone, thank you. So I think there are a few conflicting definitions in a way, because there's that practical exam focused assessment objective 3. So I teach GCSE, but also in a college as well. So that expects students to show an understanding of the relationship between the text and the context in which they were written at GCSE, but also at A level to demonstrate like this understanding of the significance and influence of the context on the literary texts and their reception. And those exam specifications are really our guiding principles in a way, and we need to make sure that for our students' sake, we are addressing those assessment objectives. And actually those marks, potentially 6 out of 30 marks at GCSE, or, 24% or so at A level, that can make the difference, can't it, between grade boundaries. So from my position in that kind of setting, it is a very practical and important part of what we do. But then I think that for me, there's this really exciting dialogue between the context and the text. And I've always found that kind of relationship really interesting. But then there's that hoped for context, or what I would, I hope context might mean, and what I'm hoping that conversations like this might develop it into, that could also be really important and exciting. So my own context, we've kind of acknowledged the positions that we're in and where we're teaching from, and how that is our guiding, is where we're our perspective. But then I also think our students' perspective and what they're bringing into the classroom and their own context as well, I think is also a really important part of what context should mean in our classrooms and when we're studying the text as well.
Thank you, Wendy. Yeah, I mean, you both raise some really important points, I think, when we're thinking about context in literature teaching, right from secondary right up into HE. And I guess from my perspective as a PGCE tutor, in a way, I sort of straddle those worlds in a kind of in lots of strange ways, I suppose. I spend a lot of time in different schools. I don't spend very long in each school, but I visit lots of schools across the year. But I'm also very engaged in scholarship around the teaching of English in schools, and spend a lot of time in the university being aware of practices within HE. So it's easy for me to be confused anyway, but it's very easy for me to feel confused when it comes to things like teaching context. I think I really love the point that Wendy just made about the reader's context. And it really put me in mind of the work of somebody like John Yandell or Barbara Bleeman, who've written about personal context and reader contexts as being very important considerations for English teachers. And I think so. Going back to my own experiences of being in schools a lot, I think I observe that thing that's already been mentioned, that there is perhaps too much leaning into historical context, and that perhaps that's what literary context has come to mean. But I recognise at the same time, as Wendy's just outlined, that is part of the assessment criteria, and students can not only get marks in an examination or an assessment, but they can really enrich their analysis of literature through an awareness of context. So I think it's not a straightforward question to answer in many ways, but it's quite an exciting one. in lots of ways, because I think it's quite a broad concept. And I think one of the reasons why we got together for this event was because we wanted to maybe unpack that a little bit and present and share with colleagues what context may mean within their own practice, I suppose. So, I mean, a couple of things that spring to mind for me are, and I realise that Janine and Wendy have referred to these already, so I'll be quick, but things like literary context, performance context, adaptation context, the reader's context, and even context related to publishing and readership and things like serialization. For me, those are really valid and valuable considerations of context, really, as well as socio-cultural, historical context as well, which I think are perhaps a little bit more familiar with. So that takes me on to the next question, which again seems really quite simplified in a way, as though it's as simple as kind of saying, yes, I like it, or no, I don't. But I think our answers probably will problematize the apparent simplicity of that. So the question I wanted to put to Janine and Wendy really is whether you think a focus on context is or can be a help or a hindrance to learning in English literature. Is it something that adds value to a student's experience and the quality of their work, or is it something that hinders what they're capable of doing in your view? Janine, can I start with you again, please?
Yeah, I think so. Speaking very specifically to a context of teaching English in higher education, which of course so many secondary school pupils will go on to do. I think I'd be fair in saying that at that level, shaping a response or writing a piece of work through the prism of context is actually quite a delimiting way of approaching the reading of a text. Even as with our own subject benchmarks with the QAA, we set learning outcomes, and we're assessing, hoping that a student does understand the context in which a piece of work has been produced. And it goes without saying that we look for indications of that all the way through when we're assessing, just general things like understanding sometimes just the gender of a writer, for example, or I specialize in teaching Black writing, and sometimes there'll be a kind of collapsing of time where there's an assumption that a writer from the Harlem Renaissance has a memory of slavery, for example, which historically wouldn't be the case. So there has to be that kind of strong, robust understanding and foundational understanding of context. But biographical context and historical context do loom really, really large. Taking something like biographical context, we often see university lecturers shying away from teaching things like Sylvia Plath's writing, for example, because her poetry is always then read through the prism of her life story. Or with African American writing, there has been a very, very recent, I think, turn away from teaching Black writing and Black film as having what the critic Michael Boyce Gillespie calls an indexical tie to Black life, as though the text becomes a window back into the past or into a particular context. But we do have a bit of creative freedom in terms of how we assess and how we teach. So sometimes it can be really fun to teach a piece of writing out without its contextual information provided, to kind of give us some indication of how context can be a little bit of a pitfall. And there's a great poet, I'm sure lots of you have heard of, E.A. Markham, Archie Markham, who notoriously sent off poems to poetry journals to be published, but used different biographical information when he submitted the poems. And it's just interesting seeing some of the responses to the work depending on which of the names he's writing as. And he was a kind of British Caribbean writer, but also, use the pseudonym of a kind of a white woman, for example. And it's just really interesting kind of using those as case studies to unpack this question of context rather than be prescriptive about how we think it should be used.
Thanks, Janine. That's really interesting. And I think the point you made about biographical and historical context looming large in the student's work that you read and how that's led to a sort of a reaction against or a move away from certain writers and certain texts, which is, I mean, I think that illustrates in a way the reason, the need for a discussion like this tonight, because that is really problematic. But equally so is the use of context to work with literature written by Black writers and female writers, for whom that is typically applied, isn't it? The biographical and historical context thing. It is really problematic, but something that it seems we should be talking about, really. Wendy, could I turn to you and ask for your thoughts on that question? Help or hindrance?
So for me, I'm thinking of some specific examples of teaching and how it can work with and for the literary text. So perhaps English teachers on this Zoom call might, have also had that same experience of teaching in Inspector Calls, and that it's transformative, where we change our mind about Mr. Burling because we know the context that he's speaking from a position of 1912, but actually we have that hindsight, and we have where he says about the Titanic being unsinkable, but yet we know that it sank. Like those moments, that's understanding the context, and that transforms the text, and it transforms the character, and the shot in the room, and the that unraveling of who he is just fantastic. And that's, I think, an example of how context can work so well, and how a writer has used context themselves. I'd love to hear more from Janine as well this evening about that crafting that I think you were talking about, with the poet there, because I think that can really create such an exciting discussion and study, and really help our students. But I think, as with anything we do, it's how we do that. How do we present that information? Because I've seen schemes of work where there's that at the start, they're just poured into with this contextual information and so on, or gap fill activities and things, to learn this context and then look at the text. Whereas I think it can help the text when those questions kind of spring from the text, as it really does with the Inspector Calls. Because if you're reading that, and some of the students will know about the Titanic and so on, but then there are gaps. And I think, in a slightly different position to Janine, where students in a secondary school, they may stop studying history at year 9. And so actually those GCSE years, there are moments that we do need to fill those gaps, and they don't know about certain historical periods. So I think there is an important place for us to think about those historical contexts. A hindrance, again, some of the ways of doing it, if there are teachers with non-specialists or not sure about the context themselves, if they don't have that subject knowledge, but also only focusing on negative context, I think that can be really damaging for lots of reasons for teachers and students. So I think it's really important. I think it helps our understanding of the text, but it's always how we go about doing that.
Thanks, Wendy. There's so many, it feels like we're unpacking so many really brilliant points that we could probably keep the discussion going for quite some time. And just before I sort of chip in and respond to some of those brilliant points, I'd like to invite anybody in attendance just to, if you've got any questions that are kind of emerging for you as you listen to us talk, please do use the chat facility to pop a question in there, and we'll try to respond to them as we go along, or if we've got a little bit of time at the end. So it'd be lovely to hear your thoughts on these things. If it's not a question, just your perspective and your view of things would be much appreciated. I loved Janine's point about reading through the prism of context and the sort of problematics of doing that, and then Wendy's your example of an Inspector Calls, where it seemed to me that you were talking about reading practice which uses the text to find kind of moments of historical contextual significance. And for me, I guess perhaps in quite a simplistic way, or an oversimplistic way, those kind of represent two opposites that kind of one of them I think does represent a hindrance or pose a hindrance to students' reading skills and their capacity for analytical reading when they read a text. And the other, I think, can be quite liberating. And I think reading through a prism is something which has triggered my interest in the teaching of context, because it's something that I've seen so often. And I was recently interviewed by the Times Educational Supplement about teachers who aren't specialists in their subject, and whether, in my experience as a PGCE tutor, that's a difficult situation or a problematic situation, something we should be avoiding. And one of the things that I talked about was the way in which, in my experience of visiting student English teachers on placement, things like historical context are used as a prism to read a text through. Because I perceived in the past that it gives teachers, certainly those teachers without a specialism in English prior to doing the PGCE, it gives them something more kind of reassuring. It's quite teachable for a start, but I think it gives teachers a reassurance that they're teaching the right thing. And I think because teachers are also very time poor, and there's an awful lot of stuff in English for teachers to get through, that context can represent, historical context and biographical context can represent very teachable material that it's possible to get through quite quickly. That's just my perception as somebody who sits at the back of the classroom observing student English teachers, that they say, but that's how the school's asked me to do things. So there's, again, you know, I feel that I'm kind of removed from the practice of classroom teachers. I see what classroom teachers do through the student teachers that I work with, in a way. But I think that idea, Wendy, of and we'll come back to this in a later question, but that idea of finding context within the text is something that I feel really passionately about. But I also take on board the point that I think you were making, in fact, if I understood that correctly, that does need to be supplemented by teacher knowledge, perhaps, or from students finding out more about historical moments or eras or events. Okay, so I think we've got. Oh yeah, in the chat. What was the school of criticism that insisted that the piece must stand alone? Interestingly, I did this as I do it as a little experiment with the PGCE English teachers every year. And I believe it was I.A. Richards at Cambridge who decided, it was where his approach of practical criticism came from, because he was so frustrated with his undergraduate students not being able to read a text without the kind of stabilizers of biographical information and that kind of thing. And the account is that he was very dismayed and depressed by his students' abilities to close read a text. And that, as Janine's mentioned there, came to be incredibly influential for the new critics in America, John Ransom Crowe, and in this country, the American T.S. Eliot. But yeah, there was I suppose a movement towards that kind of critical response to literature, which over the years has become less and less. It has less currency, I suppose. I can talk for a long time about this, because it's what my doctoral thesis was on, about the knowledge that student English teachers have of literary theory when they teach literature in the classroom. And going back to a point that Wendy made earlier, that really came from my being in classrooms and seeing the way that literature was being taught, where there was a front loading of historical context and biographical context, But at the same time, the assessment objectives for GCSE and A-level seem to be more heavily weighted towards close reading practices and personal responses. But I didn't always see that being kind of nurtured or developed. And again, it led me to a conclusion or a speculation that maybe it was because that takes a long time and teachers are very, very hard pressed time-wise. Anyway, we've got some more comments in the chat, so I'm just going to pick up on those. So we've got Sawan's asked, do you think context is taught right in secondary schools? And we'll come back to that actually. That's very similar to a question I'll ask Janine and Wendy shortly. And Fazine has asked, I'm glad you're interested. That's really nice to hear, and you're very welcome. I'd like to ask what extent is the onus on teachers to provide context, or are there opportunities for students to lead research in contexts which they may have been introduced through other subjects? So that more cross-curricular, cross-disciplinary approach. That's a really good point, really good point. And Anna's asked, exam boards seem to dislike references to writers' personal lives, but should students be actively advised not to research this? So that's quite a different approach, isn't it? Where we kind of, you know, assert a kind of a more prohibitive kind of approach to researching the writer's background. And might there be writers who should probably not be on the specs given their personal politics? That's a really interesting question. And Sheila's asked, it's obvious from the examiner's report that many students are still relying on historical and social context over literary context, but that's slowly changing. I think the key is to focus on how any context is seamlessly added to an essay, which requires multiple elements. Do speakers have a view on best practice for this, teaching how to seamlessly include it? I'm going to kind of focus on Sheila's question, because I think through that we might be able to pick up on the others. And it's such a good question, because I think realistically, that's a real challenge that English teachers face. It kind of brings together some of the more theoretical conversations we're having with the practice of, you know, how do teachers actually bring that seamlessly into a student's written discussion? And Wendy, I'm going to put you on the spot as our English teacher currently involved in 11 to 19 teaching. Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that where I find context being limiting and actually not improving our student essays is when there is, say, a bolt-on sentence to a PEE paragraph. That is unbelievably frustrating, and it's not particularly helpful at all. And it doesn't develop their writing skills. And I think they get more caught up with the PEE structure and bolting bits on than actually being able to answer the question, which then won't help them by the time they get to Geneva in their writing essays. So I think that's something that we really need to tackle at secondary school. And then I think that those sorts of activities where, you know, there's that gap fill and memorizing information, I think that students find that quite boring as well. Whereas referring to somebody's question and some of the things that I suggest through Shakespeare Race and Pedagogy is students being able to, you know, do their research and find things out as well. And that kind of collaboration and searching and exploration is really interesting in the learning process. So I think that my focus is it coming from the text, though, not front loading with contextual information. I think those questions need to arise from the text. And then within their essays, I think it should be making those implicit connections as they're analysing the language and so on. As I gave that example from an Inspector Calls, you know, we can see those connections immediately and how that could be part of their essay response. With the point about a writer's biography and how that may have influenced, I think that's really difficult in lots of ways. It you know, thinking about the different writers and different time periods and so on. So even in my PhD, I didn't really include lots of Shakespeare's own biography as such, because there's so many unknowns. You know, there are lots of historical sources and other literary texts that are in dialogue that could be, you know, evidence and connected, but actually saying Shakespeare thought this, that's not possible. You know, we will never know that, and so that's not helpful either. So I do think we need to be careful about, you know, author biography, but that will depend on the text, because it might be that it is relevant and important. So I think the top things, yeah, keeping it implicit within the essay, not front loading with just pouring in contextual information, and allowing the students to develop their reading skills of like finding that information and that independence as well, I think.
Yes, thanks very much, Wendy. I think that's great, a great perspective on it actually, and really helpful. And I know that my sort of initial introduction to this whole issue came quite a number of years ago through a conversation that I observed on Twitter, and there was a hashtag that went round for quite a while that was just tell them, and it wasn't specific to English. You know, it was actually a geographer that started it, but it seemed to gather force quite quickly that if we want students to know something and learn something, then the best approach is just to teach them. And I remember what followed was a discussion about how you wouldn't, this was the perspective of some English teachers who joined in this discussion, that you wouldn't teach A Christmas Carol without giving discrete lessons on the poor laws and the workhouse before you started the novel itself. And I remember being quite shocked by that, I suppose, because lots of people had joined in that discussion, saying that it was almost an unfair situation to put pupils in, to ask them to engage with this literature without knowing that there was a historical context that would help them make sense of it. And my argument, I didn't get involved in Twitter arguments. I don't have the capacity for it. I'm easily overwhelmed. But my initial contribution was that if the reading practice is good and the students are being taught to notice the right things in the text, and that's where the teacher's role becomes so important, that if they're guided towards the right moments in the text, most of what they need is already there. And I think, you know, that's why Wendy's point that she made before really chimed with me, because I think in a novella like A Christmas Carol, Dickens kind of gives us most of what we need to understand about Ebenezer Scrooge's life and his privilege, and those around him that have none of that privilege. Janine, could I turn to you to see if you've got anything to add?
Yeah, I've just been scribbling down some notes. So much to reflect on, and the questions are really thought-provoking. I wanted to pick up on something that Wendy said earlier about the context of the reader, which I just thought was such an astute point and so important. And I'm really interested in the relationship between context and perhaps, you know, intertextual references that you might get in some literature, and cultural capital, and just being really attuned into kind of what capital students are bringing into the classroom, or pupils are bringing into the classroom. And also not making assumptions about it. I'm often reminded of one of my very early higher education teaching experiences, where I taught the novel Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. And I just relatively recently finished studying it in the United States, where the classroom was way more diverse, actually, tons of African-American students who could pick up on the intertextual nuance of that novel in a way that I, as a British person, couldn't. And so I thought, oh, isn't that great? That's such helpful context. I'd love to be able to share that with my students in, you know, the north of England. So I was like, oh, so when he says this, that's a reference to Ralph Waldo Emerson, and when he says this is a reference to W.B. Du Bois and double consciousness, and that's actually about Booker T. Washington. And it was really alienating for the pupils who were majority white, middle class university students, because I think it was the first time they'd been confronted with not having that kind of easy access to context that perhaps comes a bit easier for certain class groups in society, and they felt left out of the text. So that was a really interesting moment for me, thinking about, well, when do we need to include context? Is there a way in which including it actually alienates the reader or your student? Because it's basically saying, let me tell you what you don't know. But, you know, I think secondary school teaching and university teaching are different in so much as, you know, there's so much at stake in terms of reward and, you know, doing well in terms of grade classifications with being able to tick certain boxes and demonstrate that knowledge. Whereas at university level, I think there's a greater emphasis on originality and finding a different way of reading something. And I suppose I wonder if that's where my hesitation around teaching context comes from, because students won't score as highly in an English literature degree if they rely heavily on historical and biographical context, because it's been done to death. So a good example of that would be, and I know that I have a lot of students who I think have done this at A-level perhaps, but Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, which is like, I mean, it's intended to be read as biographical, as having a biographical link. She has this essay, Why I Wrote the Yellow Wallpaper. And she's telling us, I've written this basically as a response to my own postpartum depression, although she doesn't use that language at the time. And because I want to address the state of women. But when I taught that text to first year undergraduate students, knowing that they probably already knew that element, or at least some of them would, I used a really helpful teaching resource that had loads of different extracts of critical takes on that. That raised really interesting questions. So actually, what if that is all true, and that can all be true, and could it be that the yellow is actually a repeated reference to the decadence movement and her interest in Oscar Wilde? Or what could it also be true that Charlotte Perkins Gilman was a notorious racist and her preoccupation with yellow is actually about her xenophobia, about East Asian immigration? And just as a way of kind of gesturing towards the possibility of writing something original, and that's what scores highly at university level. Although I did that, and 50% of the essays on that text were still about how it was about motherhood and maternity. So I'm not sure I've hacked that. But yeah, those are just some initial reflections, although I'm conscious it may not have tackled any of the specific questions we've been asked. Sorry.
Nevertheless, fascinating, and bravo for trying to, as you say, trying to disrupt some of those approaches to reading that rely on those kind of really singular or simplified versions of history. I mean, it made me think when you were talking about historical context and that comment, let me tell you what you don't know, that really kind of struck a chord with me when you said it, because I think, you know, I was talking to a colleague of mine who's a historian, and I was talking about this very issue of historical context being a prism through which a text is read, and she asked me, as a historian in HE, is that version of history itself presented as debatable? Is it presented as a narrative? You know, from a sort of historiographical perspective, you know, there'd be lots of debates about, well, whose version is that, and you know, who's interpreting it. And again, that's for me a bit of a problem when we over rely or lean too heavily into historical context, that we present students with a fairly monolithical, you know, really empirical body of knowledge about a thing that happened, and then that's used to interpret, you know, a work of fiction or something that was creative, imaginative. And I find that quite problematic. And Ellen has asked the question as well, which I'm, if it's okay, I'm going to answer this really, really quickly, because this also relates to an area of fascination and interest for me that I picked up on in my doctoral work, about the knowledge that English teachers have of literary theory and pre-1968 literary theory. And you've mentioned Barthes there. A lot of the student teachers that I interviewed for my thesis had studied Barthes' Death of the Author, but actually their interpretation of it either was a bit wild and wonderful and a bit weird at times, but also they really struggled to know what to do with that when it came to teaching literature. And I suppose in a very, very, very basic sense, one of the kind of conclusions I came to from my research was that Where theory is concerned, it's more about what the teacher does with theory rather than what they say about theory. So it's more of a sort of, it underpins their pedagogy rather than it being a topic within the subject that needs to be taught. From my perspective, I think that's more impactful. But I will stop talking about that now because we're running short of time. But Eleanor, if you wanted to email me, I'd probably put you off because you've realised I could talk about it a lot. But if you wanted to email me, you'd be really, really welcome. So just in the last couple of minutes that we've got, because I'm sure that people at this time probably want to put their feet up or get on with the rest of the day outside of English teaching. But I guess we've answered the question, what sort of work do students produce when they're prompted to focus on context? I think we've kind of covered that really. But I suppose it would be quite nice in the last couple of minutes to think about how we might teach context. And I know we've picked up on this quite a lot in the discussion as well, but maybe to end on an optimistic note. And I know that there have been lots of things there in the ideas that Janine and Wendy have put forward, but I wondered if there was anything else, certainly from guests in the meeting as well, if you wanted to contribute in the chat. But Janine, Wendy, any kind of signs of hope from your perspective about how teachers in English might kind of approach context? Sorry,
I would say I really love the points that Janine was making, and I think I really appreciate the multiplicity that you were offering there with your students. And I think that, you know, if we are thinking about mark schemes and things, even those possibilities of perhaps it could be seen as, you know, those kind of those tentative interpretations can actually score really highly. So those different possibilities and asking those questions and asking questions around the text, I think can be really, really helpful for our students and really engaging for our students as well. So providing different possibilities. I think that your point about some students feeling left out of the text, I think that that's a really important, really interesting point about that kind of alienation. But then I think that is where that implicit kind of you know, thinking about other people, it's certainly in secondary school, and I still feel this sort of sense of responsibility in those key moments of like their social emotional development of, yeah, let's think beyond ourselves, actually, can be really important.
Thank you, Wendy. Janine?
Yeah, I think that's entirely right. And I think yeah, I think I suppose what I'm interested in is making sure there's a space for students to bring in their own context and for them to feel safe when broached with gaps in their knowledge too. And I think I think it's really interesting about how that context can be used, I suppose, on the part of readers, on the part of pupils and students to make a text feel more relatable. And I just want to say that's like it's become like a little bit of an in-joke, I think, in higher education anyway, to see the phrase relatable, the word relatable used in analysis of whether or not a narrator might be successful, or, you know, how, because it begs the question, relatable to who? So I'm in complete agreement there about, you know, confronting, embracing, exploring perspectives beyond the immediate for a couple of reasons, partly because the idea that, well, it flattens and homogenizes certain groups. I think even if we think about, well, let's get this group of students to experience something over here, that group of students is probably not homogenous in the first place, even if they share, you know, various different markers. But also because there are limits, I think, to how far any particular group or individual can identify with another, which I think is something that, you know, certainly something that I'm trying to explore in my own practice at the moment, because I think there is a distinct difference that Wendy articulated really beautifully there about what our responsibilities as educators are. And I think, you know, as somebody who works primarily with adults, thinking about to what extent my responsibility is to develop empathy or those sorts of things, I feel like I'm moving slightly away from that because I don't know that that's the role of higher education, frankly. But I do think that I recognise and embrace there's a very different set of responsibilities, I think, when we're working with young people. And so sometimes that's kind of nice because we do different things, and that's what we can do with students when they get to us, is to think, oh, hang on, well, what are the limits here of empathy, and what are the limits of reading the text, and what do we do with a character who doesn't want to be read, actually, that is resisting any contextual information? What do we do with that, and why is that there? So we get to get a bit meta, I suppose, as we move further away from it. But, you know, we get to do that and have that play and that joy because of the excellent foundation that students arrive with, because of the work that you're all doing and so many people here are doing. So yeah, it's interesting to see how it joins up.
Yeah, oh, yeah, absolutely. Wow. I mean, I could keep this discussion going and listening to Wendy and Janine's views on context. It's just really edifying, actually, and really enriching in terms of, you know, you come to a discussion like this and kind of think, you know, what you think, and then it's lovely to have your mind completely open to lots of different avenues and aspects of the topic. And really quickly, and I will say this in sort of 20 seconds, but for me, there is a real thing for English teachers around professional development, and it kind of touches a little bit on the question about theory that Eleanor asked. And I wish there was more in the way of professional development for English teachers that help them to see how their practice in the classroom is actually driven by theoretical approaches in the world of literary studies, and that theoretical approaches are very much baked into the assessment objectives of the GCSE and A-level specifications. Because I think if English teachers had greater access to some of those discussions and some of that knowledge, I think it would be really, really helpful for them, and I think English teachers would be really interested in it. But that's all I'll say there. And what a fantastic discussion. I'm conscious of the fact that we've overrun, but I really don't mind, because it was just so fantastic and really enriching. And I'm sure everybody will join me in thanking Dr. Janine Bradbury and Dr. Wendy Lennon for coming along tonight and sharing their perspectives and their expertise with us all in the meeting. And of course, I'd like to thank everybody for coming along on a Tuesday afternoon in October. Can't believe it's October after a long day, I'm sure. So thank you very, very much for coming along and joining us for the discussion. I've put into the chat a link to the events page at the English Association. So please do take a look and see if there are any other events that you fancy attending, because there are lots of other discussions similar to this one. So it would be great to see you at some of those. But I'll bid you all a good evening, and once again, thank you for coming, and all the best for the rest of the term. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Ah, yes. Happy Poetry Day for Thursday. Thank you, Soa. I'll just end the recording.